let's move on to our last question, which is question 3, and it brings us back really to our plays. This question, how did Shakespeare portray women in his plays, is a theme that we saw last year in the concorso, in the domande disciplinari, in many, many regions. There were plays, there were questions about specific women, there were questions about specific female characters, about women in general. And I think in general, just the idea of connecting Shakespeare and women, or getting us nowadays to think about Shakespeare and women. It's a very modern thing to do, of course, but it's obviously connected to wider themes of women in society and our modern world. So it's not surprising to see that as a theme. So I thought it would be good to have a look at how we can look at women in different ways in Shakespeare, and also how we can identify some plays, some key plays where this Shakespeare is looking at women in certain ways. So let's look at how I would divide a question like this. I would look at women in power. I would look at women in love and women as victims of patriarchy. And of course, any one of these could be their own question on the domande disciplinari. Tell me about women in power. Tell me about women in love. Let's start with power. Here we have a very powerful woman from Shakespeare. This is, of course, Cleopatra and or Antony. So women in power in Shakespeare, they are navigating and exerting power in a male-dominated world. Of course they are. It's Elizabethan England. And many of Shakespeare's women are actually from the classical antiquities, where women had even less power, shall we say. But certainly women, the world of Elizabethan England, women don't have that much power. Now, obviously, that's in contrast to the fact that Elizabeth was the queen, but she, as we know, was aware of the lack of suitability of a woman to be queen and drew on being a man or being as good as a man in her own rhetoric. So we know that it was a male-dominated world. And so we see women in Shakespeare who try to take power. We see them really as their power seeking as acts of transgression. Transgression meaning that they are defying social norms and expectations, stepping over lines of what is appropriate for a woman. Because in this time, of course, women were supposed to be weak, submissive, nurturing, obedient. They weren't supposed to be ruling the world, technically. At least that's not the world that most of them were living in. And of course, the women in power in Shakespeare, unfortunately, often end in tragedy. We'll have a look at one of those in particular. I'm not saying all of the women in power end in tragedy, but the women who go to the heights of power, where men want to go to, where men are, they usually end very badly. And yeah, many of you put in the chat, but the first one that came to mind for me, of course, is Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. She is the classic transgressor, isn't she? So, of course, Macbeth, the play about Macbeth, the Scottish nobleman who, through ambition, I suppose that unchecked ambition, wants to become king. But it is not his ambition in the beginning of that play that drives the action of the play. It is Lady Macbeth's ambition. And we see early in the play, Lady Macbeth has to convince Macbeth to kind of try to become the king, to do the killings. So she tells him, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent underneath. She realizes that you have to play a game, and the game is you have to appear to be the flower and be the conniving Machiavellian character behind the scenes. And she draws on the female image of the flower. This is what she tells Macbeth. And so she manages to convince him, but she needs to draw on some power, I suppose, early in the play to kind of get that power to do the killing. because there's some killing that needs to be done. And she says famously, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the top, toe top full of direst cruelty. Unsex me here." She asks the spirits, the witches, the mystical world to remove her femininity, to remove her femaleness, because to be female and to be evil and to be ambitious even and to want to kill or achieve is not natural. She wants to be desexed, unsexed. And so the play continues, and of course we see early that Macbeth, when the killing happens, suffers hallucinations, can't really cope with the guilt, and we see Lady Macbeth kind of rising to the challenge and wiping the blood. We know she creates the scene that she defers that blame and makes sure that Macbeth doesn't get caught for that killing. We see her here wiping the blood, and she's kind of portrayed as being able to cope with all this. But of course, as the play goes on, we see Macbeth, who initially feels guilt and uncertainty about this action, rise in power and in lack of guilt. And Lady Macbeth, we see her spiral through the play, don't we? So she begins in a position of taking and snatching the power and doing the killing. But as the play goes on, she completely unravels. And by the end, of course, we know that she's unable to cope with the deeds that she's done. She realizes that she has transgressed, I suppose, too far, and all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. And so she again calls on that female imagery to say, you know, even if I stepped back and became a woman again, I am not able to be a woman anymore. I can't do it because I've transgressed too far. And there's a kind of suggestion, this is always tricky with Shakespeare because we're reading it so much later. There's a kind of suggestion that there is a psychological cost. Her mental unraveling and eventual suicide off stage is caused because of a kind of psychological cost that she has to pay for that transgression of the moral line that she crossed. Yeah. And possibly, although it's very hard to say with Shakespeare, was he trying to say, how unfair is it that women can't be like men? You know, Macbeth has no problem, he can cope. Or was he not? Was he saying women can't cope? I think it's unlikely he was trying to say that women aren't as good as men. He had a female king. He had a female queen before James the First. Now Macbeth was written for James the First, so it's very hard to know. But I imagine what he wanted was he wanted to talk more about what power can do, how it can corrupt even women. There's a kind of equality almost between the characters, although the trajectory is different. Possibly. We could talk about this for a long time. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Leave you thinking about why does he portray Lady Macbeth like this? The next one is women in love, a little bit nicer topic maybe. We can see that, of course, female characters and women in the Elizabethan age, you know, it's not a single woman kind of era. This is a time when you have a partner or you're trying to find a partner or you're involved in a union of some kind. So often the women in Shakespeare are defined by their romantic relationships. They're not independent single women. But I think we must notice in Shakespeare how they are more than passive lovers. And often it's the men who are a little bit more passive and the women who are more agentive. So I think the key qualities that we see in many of the women are things like courage. We see Cordelia in King Lear really standing up to her father as a woman. That takes courage to stand up to the king and not give him what he wants. We see intelligence. Portia is in The Merchant of Venice, of course, Portia is an incredibly intelligent character. She saves Antonio with her speech in the courtroom at the end. It is her intelligence that saves his life. That's given to a woman, that job of saving his life. And of course, we have agency. And I think a great play where we see all of these things, and especially the agency or the driving, we see in Romeo and Juliet. So Juliet, of course, in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet Capulet and Romeo Montague, Juliet is really the much more agentive character in this play. She drives the whole thing. She obviously warring families, Verona, things aren't good. Nobody even knows, can't remember why it started, can't remember when it started, but the Capulets and the Montagues hate each other. It's not going to be a great union, but they fall in love. And Juliet doesn't sort of just let it happen. She actually makes it happen. And she pushes Romeo or prompts him and encourages him to action too. We see when they meet that she says to him, "You kiss by the book." This is kind of an insult, really. She's saying to him, "Oh, aren't you very conventional?" Which means to set herself as unconventional or certainly as not straight down the middle. Yeah, she's a woman who doesn't want to be like everybody else. And we see, she says, "If that thy bent of love be honorable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow." She really, although marriage has been on the table in the conversation, she really says to Romeo, okay, so if we're going to get married, let's do it. Not a great proposal, maybe, but she certainly pushes on that marriage possibility and pushes the action forward, really. And at the end, although the end is not a happy end, shall we say, Juliet doesn't die at the hand of somebody else. She dies at her own hand, of course. And she says, as she grabs the dagger, "Oh, happy dagger," because possibly she's made that choice. That's her choice. And obviously, again, what's Shakespeare trying to say? Maybe it's not her choice. Maybe he's trying to say, look at the limits of the choices and possibilities that women have in society. And I think there's a lot of that going on in Romeo and Juliet about the possible, yeah, where women can possibly get to and what they can achieve. But, you know, we see her trying. We see Juliet trying, certainly, in this play. Okay, so that's our women in love. Let's get our final kind of woman, which I think is pretty much all of Shakespeare's women, I suppose we could say, that we see really, I think, unfortunately, now reading Shakespeare in the 21st century, we see women as victims of patriarchy or patriarchy, the complex power system that I want to say has got away, but of course we can't really say that, can we? So this picture is, some people have already noted, it's Ophelia from Hamlet. And this painting was painted a long time after the Elizabethan age. This is from the Pre-Raphaelites in the 1800s. This is Gabriele Rossetti. And they were kind of obsessed with all of these tragic heroines and stuff, so they like to paint them. But I think Ophelia is a good example of, obviously, a woman as a victim of patriarchy. And we see this particularly in the tragedies, of course. We see that, I think I read Shakespeare as very aware of these power structures of his time. I think he reflects harsh realities. I don't think he puts them on the stage to reinforce them. I think he's cleverer than that. And I think he puts them there for us to contemplate and to recognize and to reflect on. I think he really, I want to believe, because I love Shakespeare, that he's really calling for gender equality. You know, he's someone in society. He lives with women, around women, you know, has a great relationship with women by all accounts in his life. I think he's trying to ask the audience and Elizabethan and Jacobin England to look at how we treat women. And he's using the stage as a mirror to the self, I think. I think the strongest evidence we have of this, and the reading I would give to Othello, is one of trying to shake his audience and make us think, what are we doing? How can it get to this, I think. And I think Shakespeare uses extremities in many of his plays to question, to make the audience sit up and question, like, what? That's crazy. I can't believe that that would happen. But also, yeah, sure, that could happen. Let's reflect on that. So in Othello, we have Desdemona, of course, the tragic character. We have Othello, the probably Black or definitely Moorish African um, uh, general in the Venetian army, and we have Desdemona, the white Venetian noblewoman. We can also read this play, obviously, as a race, through a racial lens and such things, but for the purposes of today, I want to look at it as kind of Shakespeare holding up society and asking it to really look at itself, give it a hard, cold look at itself and how we treat women. And is this okay? So Desdemona, as we know, defies her father. Her father's Brabantio, defies her father to marry Othello. It's not a match that is condoned, and they elope to get married. She shows agency, of course, in that. But we have, unfortunately, Desdemona really is a pawn or an object in the center of all this men and these male, I think, toxicity, really. This play is about, I think, it's about male toxicity, toxic masculinity, as we now call it. Othello, who is just completely unaware, I think, of the manipulation, the Machiavellian moves that Iago is playing on him, feeding him these lies. But ultimately, Othello sees Desdemona as a threat to himself and a threat to society. So much so that at the end of Othello, of course, he has to kill Desdemona because she has betrayed him, or at least he thinks she has betrayed him. We see Brabantio, the prideful father, who also agrees, really, that Desdemona must die because yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. And in the end, she does die, of course. She is murdered. And we have this scene of Othello holding Desdemona like, I had to kill her. Of course I did. And I think that's Shakespeare's asking the audience to sit up and say, like, really? Do we have to kill the women? I know that's a very modern reading, but I do think that that's possible, and I at least want to think it's possible, that he's trying to really make people think about the misogyny, the possessiveness, the kind of objectification that was so prevalent in Elizabethan England, and ask the audience to kind of wake up a little bit. At least that's how I'm going to read it. And I would encourage you to think about what you think it means as well, of course, as I would with all of Shakespeare. But that kind of brings us to the end of our session.